Can you make out what's really going on?
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Yes, so today the Director of National Intelligence testified in front of House Intelligence, and at press time, as we record our Thursday program here, he was en route to the Senate to do that version. And I'm trying to figure out what the pulse of Southern New England is on this entire matter. I spoke to a young person attending college yesterday and asked what they thought of this, and the blank stare came back, like, huh? I think that hopefully is rare, and good college kids are focused on their own stuff, right? But one of the things I think is kind of incredible about what's happened with this president and how he's comported himself, and the conflict and admittedly acrimony that we've had on both sides over the course of his both campaign and tenure, is that the buzz and the drone of "Are you kidding me?" has really numbed us. And this is not the first time I've said that. But when the term impeachment is used, even if you think it's highly partisan, and even if you think it's not necessarily well thought out, when a formal impeachment inquiry is launched, it's historic. And I don't get a general sense that the public feels the historic nature of it. I'll ask my guest about that, amongst other things, including the actual details of the story. Timothy Edgar is one of my key go-to guys when it comes to national intelligence issues, cybersecurity. He's expert on that. He's worked for both sides of the aisle in the White House. Author of the book, After Snowden. Let me just read you the headline here from today's midday stuff. This is Joseph McGuire, who is the acting director of national intelligence. Talk about a hot seat. He's only been there about 6 weeks, right? Here's what the network had to kind of summarize what we had up until the time early this afternoon.
The acting director of national intelligence, Joseph McGuire, told House lawmakers he initially withheld the whistleblower complaint from Congress because many allegations in it were based on conversations President Trump had with a foreign leader.
Such calls are typically subject to executive privilege, a privilege that I do not have the authority to waive.
The report, written by a still unknown government employee, was released to the public today. The author alleges President Trump used the power of his office to solicit interference from a foreign country in the 2020 U.S. election, in part based on a phone call with Ukraine's leader, where he urged him to investigate Joe Biden and his son.
Our president sacrificed our national security and our Constitution for his personal political benefit.
This appears to be the first intelligence community whistleblower complaint that has ever been withheld from Congress. Is that right, sir?
Congressman Carson, I believe that it might be. And once again, I said in my statement, it is, in fact, as far as I'm concerned, unprecedented.
House Democrats launched an official impeachment inquiry this week following the revelations about Ukraine, a process that could take weeks or months.
Republicans are accusing Democrats of grandstanding and creating a fake story.
The complaint relied on hearsay evidence provided by the whistleblower. The Inspector General found the whistleblower displayed arguable political bias against Trump.
President Trump calls any talks of impeachment a witch hunt.
Welcome, senior fellow. You're pretty good at cutting through the mustard on this thing. But before we get to the story itself, do you get a general sense, like I do, that this impeachment thing, at least if you compare it to prior experiences, say Nixon wasn't around for Jackson, right? But I was here for Clinton.
Yeah.
Kind of like, I don't know if it's a yawn, but kind of a I'm not sure.
I wouldn't say that in terms of the substance. In terms of the substance, I think this is as serious as anything
I'm
we've
talking
had
about the
since
public's
Nixon.
response to it.
I think it's too new for people to have absorbed what really happened.
I wonder if that's what the case was back when Nixon was first getting into hot water.
Sure. I mean, we had months and months of headlines, beginning with the Watergate break-in, and people yawned for a long time until finally it kind of sunk in. And also we had direct evidence. Now we've got the direct evidence a lot quicker in the form of this memorandum about the telephone call. But yeah, I think it takes a while for the public to really sink in what just happened here, which is that the president made a corrupt or tried to make a corrupt bargain, pressured a foreign leader to investigate his political opponent in the upcoming election. There's really nothing more serious when it comes to impeachment that I can think of.
Yet the foreign leader is quick to say he felt no pressure.
Well, I mean, how many people say that they do feel pressure, right? I mean, if this were an ordinary organized crime case and you went to somebody who's under pressure by the mob and they say, I don't feel any pressure, you wouldn't believe them. And I mean, they're under enormous pressure. Their request for military assistance, $391 million, had been held up by the president. They're fighting a war with Russia. They wanted missiles. They wanted missiles to fire at potentially Russian tanks. That was what was on the line for them. So of course they're not going to say something to get the president angry. They're facing a war that they need the president's help for.
All right, let's go back and start from the beginning. Once upon a time here, there's a whistleblower who says, hey, listen, I've got some information.
Right.
And the information gets relayed to the Inspector General. And the Inspector General has a responsibility to forward it to the Director of National Intelligence under the whistleblower laws. Let's go backwards even further. The reason we have this kind of unique setup for whistleblowing,
right?
By the way, you know, it's kind of funny. You use a word over and over again or a term over and over again, it either becomes funny or loses its meaning, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the term whistleblower over and over again, kind of people go, can we find another term for it? But we can't. I mean, the whistleblower is certainly a concept. The concept is, whistleblower is, fill in the blank.
Right, so if somebody sees wrongdoing in any
Simple as
organization and they want to be able to report it in a way that allows it to be addressed, and they can't just tell their boss because it's going on within that organization itself, so they need some channel to do it.
And we say whistleblower because we want to give that person credibility. We've called them tattletale, then it would be, you know, it'd be a condescending or narc, you know,
Right.
or
Well,
any of those things. I mean, that,
reports are Trump is calling him a spy, which is, you know, just another example of how serious the threat is here to the Constitution, that you have the president labeling this patriotic person who filed a complaint anonymously, correctly, through the correct channels, did not leak it, you know, as if they did something wrong.
all right, so the whistleblower laws are in place because
the Congress, the public, we can't know what's going on that's wrong in our government, especially in our secret agencies of our government, except by the people who are working there. So you need to protect people who see that wrongdoing, give them a chance to report it. One of the things I talked about in the book Beyond Snowden was this whole controversy about whether Snowden is a whistleblower or not. In a classic sense, he's not, because he didn't see illegal activity and report it through the right channels. And a lot of people who don't like Snowden make this point over and over again. Why didn't he use the whistleblower channels? So this individual, we don't know if it's a man or a woman, did use the whistleblower channels. And one of the things that's...
he's been referred to by him as a he a couple of times by members of Congress who originally saw the complaint. So for what that
I don't
is
know.
worth. But anyway, your point.
My point is that this person did exactly the right thing. And one of the things that's really troubling, and one of the reasons that DNI was under a lot of heat today, is that then the complaint got stuck because the White House and the Justice Department basically stopped it from going to Congress. The law says this complaint should have gone to Congress within 14 days. And instead, the White House and the Justice Department, that is Trump and Attorney General Barr, who were subjects of the complaint, actually, stepped in and said, no, don't send this to Congress. And the DNI felt he had no choice but to to go along with that. And so that's why he's under a certain amount of criticism today for doing that.
Yeah, he talks about the precedent of this. When we come back, we'll talk about the unprecedented nature of this particular case. And so what? It's just a phone call.
And this week, the president has admitted to asking the president of Ukraine to take actions which would benefit him politically. The actions of the Trump presidency revealed the dishonorable fact of the president's betrayal of his oath of office, betrayal of our national security, and betrayal of the integrity of our elections. Therefore, today, I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry. I'm directing our 6 committees to proceed with their investigations under that umbrella of impeachment inquiry. The president must be held accountable. No one is above the law.
Well, okay. The flags behind her, the impeachment inquiry announcement. It's kind of interesting. There was no floor vote for an official impeachment inquiry. There is no protocol to declare
That's right.
an official impeachment inquiry.
Yeah.
The speaker really kind of controls the shots.
I think this was, to send a signal that she supports an impeachment inquiry. Republicans have been making that point, and they're perfectly right to make it. You do need a floor vote to actually officially begin an impeachment inquiry. And so that'll be the first step, I would think, is to have that vote and see if they have the votes for it. But I look at that phone call, and to me, it's a smoking gun.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because one of your comrades at Brown that I rely on, a constitutional scholar, Corey Brettschneider, suggested that it's irrelevant that the speaker has declared the impeachment inquiry, that it's a minor matter and disputable as to whether she even needs a floor vote to begin the inquiry. I've always wondered how you move from just taking a look to an impeachment inquiry. It's kind of like saying, hey, I'm really, really, really concerned. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm really, really, really concerned.
I think it's a detail. It's important in terms of whether the courts will support the Congress's right to subpoena information and documents. It's not very important in terms of the ultimate Constitution. The Constitution says the House votes to impeach, and the House has its own rules about how to have an inquiry, what to do, and you can debate about whether those rules are being followed or not, but when it comes down to it, you need a majority to vote for articles of impeachment.
When they actually issue the impeachment, which is the indictment.
Exactly. So I think he's right in the sense that announcement is more of a political announcement than it is something that's
But your point on the judges is very important. He suggests that just her formality of announcement would lead any court to proceed under an impeachment environment. Anyway.
It certainly strengthens their case.
Or they go back for a vote if they need it.
The executive branch has been stonewalling just unbelievably in ways that really kind of make a mockery of concepts like executive privilege and classified information. They've been telling people to basically hold Congress in contempt by citing privileges that don't exist. The problem is the House doesn't have a good way of enforcing that except by going into the courts, which is a time-consuming process. If they can say, we're doing this because we're trying to investigate impeachment, that gives them a stronger case in the courts. That's really what that's all about.
All right. So going back to where we are with this case, most of what has been called out here by the whistleblower centers around this conversation with President Zelensky of the Ukraine. There is some color and context in the whistleblower complaint that I think ought to see the light of day. One of which I think is interesting when he suggests, or she suggests, that the sources that spoke to he or she suggest that at the end at the end of his letter, I should say, that the very idea that the president of Ukraine was able to have a phone conversation had to be dependent on this willingness to, quote, play ball.
Yes.
So let me read. During the same time frame, multiple U.S. officials told me that Ukraine leadership was led to believe that a meeting or phone call between the president and President Zelensky would depend on whether he showed willingness to play ball on the issues that had been publicly aired by Mr. Lutsenko and Mr. Giuliani. So that tells me something, because the President of the United States in this transcript, or this memo of the transcript, refers to Joe Biden the first time by last name.
Yeah, yeah.
Without the formality of introducing a concept or a person, which means that this is an ongoing matter.
That's right. This was not an isolated phone call. It's very clear from the whistleblower complaint and just from the public record, and a lot of what's in the whistleblower complaint is on the public record, that the president had ordered a hold on this assistance to Ukraine, that he had sent Giuliani to talk to Ukrainian officials without any consultation with the official State Department or the people that's supposed to do foreign policy.
Giuliani on Fox News the other night held up his cell phone and said, "I've got the proof. The State Department sent me." But he's claiming the State Department sent him.
Well, you might want to talk to the Director of National Intelligence about that, because he basically said, "I have no idea who Giuliani is. I couldn't even characterize him," and it's his job to advise the State Department. So there's a lot going on here, but it's very clear just from the call itself that the president said, "I want a favor before I give you this military assistance." He doesn't say that part, but he says, "I want a favor," just when he's asked about military assistance. And then he says, and here are the two things I need from you. One is to investigate Joe Biden. The other thing is this kind of weird reference to CrowdStrike and a server. That's about a conspiracy theory that it wasn't the Russians who hacked the DNC in 2016, that it was the Ukrainians, and that they were doing it as some sort of false flag operation. So a lot of people haven't paid attention to that, but essentially what the president was asking the president of Ukraine is, help me with my conspiracy theory. You know, still arguing about whether the Russians were even doing the hacking. So these are two things that are going to interfere with the ability of the United States to have a fair election in 2020. They're personal political favors that the President of the United States is asking a foreign leader in exchange for military assistance against aggression from Russia. Let's see, that's what he's saying. He's saying, if you don't do these favors for me, I am going to withhold assistance that you need to defend yourself against Russia. I don't see how anything could be more serious than that. And it's right there in black and white. There's really no question that that's what happened on that phone call. All you have to do is read it, but you have to understand the context in order to understand that.
Is there anything that you can point to, or anybody can point to, that is a devastating result of this behavior?
Well, so
other than precedent and bad environment and distrust for America and potential 2020, is there anything we can tangibly say that ends up being the ultimate reason why he's got to go?
Well, I think that, you know, the question really, you've said this before, I think, Dan, is not who is Trump. We know who Trump is. We know this is the kind of thing he does. He's admitted it. That, yeah, I would accept help from a foreign power. He didn't say he'd ask for it or pressure a foreign power. That's what he's done. The question is, who are we, right? And I think this is why it's sort of broken the dam when it comes at least to the Democrats in the House, which is, you know, hey, we don't know if this is going to work. We don't know if the Senate's ever going to come around, but we've got to do something here because this is about who we are. And I think they're right about that. It really pained me to watch the acting DNI, you know, a great patriot, somebody who served in the Navy, sit there this morning and say, when he was asked a question, if somebody did this, is it illegal, is it wrong? And he just couldn't answer the question. And the reason he couldn't answer it is because he's serving the President Trump. Of course the answer is yes. You know, that to me, it was painful to watch.
He doesn't want to fall on that sword. Why not?
He's made a decision that he can do a better job from the inside. I don't know whether that's the right decision or not for him personally. But
well, we've often talked about this dynamic too, having really good people around Donald Trump who are patriots, who do the calculations on the benefits for the American people's protection despite him.
And I think he believes that it's his job to protect the whistleblower, to protect the Inspector General, to protect the process. He ended up getting tarnished, though, because instead of doing what the law says, which is you need to provide this to Congress in 14 days, he allowed himself to get sidelined by the White House and the Justice Department telling him he couldn't. And he went along with that, thinking that, to be fair to him, that's the normal process. When it's not the president, when it's some other issue, yeah, of course, you know, if there's executive privilege, you deal with the White House. If there's legal issues, you deal with the Justice Department. But here it was like asking the suspect in a case, hey, do you want me to share your information? Yeah. Look, the point is it's about who we are. And when somebody has to get up there and say this isn't a big deal, I mean, I saw a number of defenders of the president get up there and say, well, this wasn't a big deal and this wasn't a quid pro quo. I mean, you're just saying black is white. Of course it's a quid pro quo. It says it right in there. I want a favor. I mean, that's you. People have been sent to jail. Mafia bosses have been sent to jail for language a lot less clear than that.
When we come back, the nonchalance by the Republicans. So allies say this is no big deal, this impeachment thing. In fact, there are many political theories that suggest that you're just playing into Donald Trump's hands, and impeachment without a conviction in the Senate is exactly what he's looking for to bolster his campaign, blah, 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 da, da, da. That may be true.
We don't know.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. The more the case is out there and the more that the scenario plays out, the more the American public might say, wait a second, man, this is too much. But their nonchalance is, in some ways, horrifying, isn't it?
I think that's one of the worst things that has been true of the whole Trump presidency, but you see that here. I mean, the President of the United States is on a transcript or a summary of a call asking a foreign leader to investigate his political opponent and saying that that is a favor the foreign leader needs to do in order to give him military assistance against Russia. That's what that call says. And for anyone to say that's not a big deal, I mean, certainly the White House staff knew it was a big deal because they immediately tried to cover it up. They took that memo out of the normal system and they put it in the most secret classified system the White House has.
And it was unclassified at its start.
Absolutely. They put it in the system that's for the most sensitive things like the bin Laden raid. They knew how explosive that conversation was right away because it's obvious. And when somebody is told, you know, because of your political loyalties, you have to pretend the obvious isn't true, it really distorts, you know, it distorts their integrity.
We only have a few seconds. How many times have I asked you, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? 30 seconds.
I don't think that Democrats have any choice but to vote for impeachment now based on what happened. And whatever happens in the Senate is going to be whatever the Senate decides to do. But I don't think they can sit around and decide, well, we'll let this pass for political reasons. I think they sort of had that choice before because, you know, it was a little bit less clear because it had been a long thing. But now I just think it's too clear for them to ignore.
Thanks for perspective. Final word when we come back. It's, look, it's a head shaker. It's a head shaker. And I would love to be able to find somebody around here of formal nature who will come here and tell us that this is no big deal. Our federal elected officials are not of that ilk. But there's no doubt that this thing is going to roll down to some kind of impeachment vote. The Democrats will have the majority. I don't know how long it's going to take and what they got to load up to do it, but they're going to load up to do it. Mostly, I would hope, for the right reasons. Tomorrow, the hospital merger. It's still a controversy. See you on the Radio 3 on WPRO as well. Good night.